Okay, so this week we're still looking at the Middle Kingdom, and an object or objects I'd like to look at are Egyptian fortresses, especially built in Nubia. We've talked about how in the Middle Kingdom there was a big push into Nubia, and the obvious reason is because it was a very wealthy area in terms of metals, cattle, and so on. So the Egyptians were very interested in controlling that area. And what we end up seeing is various pharaohs building massive forts. So you've got Senusret the first, second, third. They're all building fortresses pretty deep into Nubian territory. And what we find is that you've got roads being built deep into Nubia. And then we've got a little bit of information on how the Nubians were actually seen by the Egyptians. And I give you a quote here. This is found on like a mile marker stone by one of the fortresses, and it was done during the time of Senusret III. And you can see what it says here. They are not people one respects. They are wretches, craven-hearted. My majesty has seen it. It's not an untruth. I've captured their women. I've carried off their dependents. So you can tell a little bit about how the Egyptians see the Nubians, and it also tells you a bit about slavery, where they're taking these people to work. What's also interesting and probably not surprising is that you've got the title of nomarch disappearing. And I've got a little question why. I'd like you to think about it, but you can probably guess. If you remember, the nomarchs were devised, and the nomes were devised to break up the large area to govern Egypt, where we put governors in place. As we talked about with the end of the Old Kingdom and into the first intermediate period, the nomarchs get quite a bit of power, and then things break down in the first intermediate period, and the nomarchs are essentially the rulers. There's multiple rulers in Egypt during that period. So during the Middle Kingdom, it's pretty clear by getting rid of the titles and getting rid of the offices, the pharaohs are concerned about keeping their control over these areas. Now here's a map. It's not the best map, but this is coming from the atlas that I have assigned to you, so you can look this up, where it lists a bunch of the fortresses that were built deep into Nubian territory. And I've got a couple slides showing you some of these fortresses. So this is one called Buhan. And if you look at the scale down at the bottom, that is 100 meters or 300 feet. So you can see that this is a fairly large fortress that's built, and then you can see all the rooms that were built inside, and then there's these very large walls built beyond the fortress, also as protection. And here you've got another one. You can see the scale down at the bottom here. And then you can look at sort of the interior geometry, if that's what you want to call it, the rooms that were set up to house all of the soldiers, and of course there's granaries in there, and so on. And then this slide probably isn't the best unless you're sitting on a big screen, but you can see some more of the fortresses and how they're built. They all sort of have the same structure. You've got the large walls on the outside, and then all the interior rooms to house the soldiers. This one I've blown up a bit. This is the Semna fortress. It's an interesting one, not necessarily for the building itself, but because we have something called the Semna dispatches. And I mentioned this in the lecture, which is the overview of the Middle Kingdom Part 2. These are letters written back and forth from the fortresses to the Egyptian rulers about what's going on. And so they tell us a couple things. They tell us about how they're keeping watch over the Nubians and the Nubian territory. And then they also talk about security concerns for the forts themselves. So how the forts are being controlled, how the soldiers are living, and so on. They're actually really interesting. And you can look these up, just type in Semna dispatches, and you can read some of those texts. So this is the last slide I have, a fairly short lecture, but what can these tell us about sustainability? So think back about the Egyptians building, these pyramid towns. Think about all the effort that was done. So these fortresses are exactly the same, except you are now outside of Egyptian territory. So all this material has to go south into Nubia. So they have to be built. So think about all the process of being built. A lot of these were mud bricks, but the bricks had to be built. They had to be built up. And then you've got a fortress. Now you have the people inside. So the troops need to be fed, they need to be watered, or whatever you want to call it, beer being made, and so on. You also have information about like social status in terms of who these military commanders are and who the soldiers are. You've got military excursions. Now they're going outside and they're capturing people, as we just saw from that stele I read that little bit on. They are gathering wealth. People are paying taxes to the fortresses. And then all this wealth needs to be brought back into Egypt. So it was a massive moneymaker for Egypt during this time, which is why, as I talked about in the overview of the Middle Kingdom Part 2, this really was a high point in Egyptian society. And it's partly because all of the wealth that's being brought in from Nubia.